Queen Nzinga walked into a Portuguese negotiation room. They refused to give her a chair. What she did next would humiliate Portugal for 4 decades. In 1622, in Luanda, the heart of the Portuguese slave empire in West Central Africa, the governor, João Correia de Souza, in an arrogant show of force, offered the Ndongo queen's envoy Nzinga a mat on the cold floor instead of a chair. It was a calculated, profound insult demanding submission. But Nzinga did not kneel. Instead, with a calm that defied the immense tension in the room, she signaled her attendant. The attendant instantly dropped to all fours directly behind the mat, and Nzinga moved swiftly, settling onto the attendant's back. In an instant, she had transformed a personal humiliation into a throne, rising to meet the governor's eyes as a reigning sovereign. This silent act of defiance was the first shot in a 40-year resistance. But that was just the beginning of her genius. How do you defeat an enemy with superior muskets, cavalry, and fortified positions? Nzinga's solution was to become strategically unrecognizable. She fled her kingdom, joined a fearsome cannibalistic warrior cult to harness its power, and publicly renounced her title as queen to adopt the male warrior name king. And then, when the time was right, she betrayed her allies, converted to Christianity, and took the European baptismal name Dona Ana de Sousa. She was the African ruler who used gender, religion, and geopolitical betrayal as her weapons. This is the untold story of the military genius who humiliated the Portuguese Empire for decades. Why did Nzinga adopt the name king? What was the military purpose behind her Christian baptism? And what was the brilliant strategy that secured a sovereign, independent state right on the edge of the slave coast? We find out as the story of Queen Nzinga unfolds. To understand the sheer desperation with which Nzinga fought the Portuguese, one must understand the devastating geography and the sheer ambition of the European invaders. By the early 17th century, the once stable kingdom of Ndongo in modern-day Angola was being torn apart. The source of the devastation was the Portuguese port of Luanda, a ravenous colonial enterprise built entirely on the export of enslaved people. Ndongo sat precariously in the interior, directly in the path of the relentless slave raids. Years of devastating warfare had left the kingdom crippled, its manpower depleted, and its sovereign, Nzinga's brother, the Ngola king, demoralized. The Portuguese had long since perfected the devastating tactic of divide and conquer. They didn't need to commit vast numbers of their own troops. They simply armed and paid Ndongo's rivals, chiefly the nomadic, ferocious Mbande warrior cults and other local chieftains, to do their raiding for them. This economic and military pressure had shattered the social fabric of Ndongo, leaving Nzinga's brother ready to concede. It was in this moment of near total collapse that Nzinga, already known for her intellect and political sharpness, was sent as an envoy to negotiate a peace treaty in 1622. The governor of Luanda, João Correia de Souza, saw her arrival not as a diplomatic opportunity, but as a final act of surrender. It was then that he staged the calculated insult, offering her only a mat on the floor while he sat in a high chair. Nzinga's response, ordering an attendant to serve as her chair to rise to eye level, was a direct, clear signal of the 40 years of strategic genius to come. It was a refusal to accept the terms of inferiority. She secured an immediate treaty, but understood it was meaningless. The Portuguese would never honor any agreement that slowed the flow of slaves. When her brother died in 1624, Nzinga seized power, shattering cultural convention by declaring herself the new Ngola. She inherited a collapsing kingdom, surrounded by enemies who were all vying for her people's bodies. The Portuguese immediately refused to recognize her, supporting a puppet ruler instead. Nzinga realized she could not win a conventional war. Ndongo had the numbers, but the Portuguese had the firepower, the fortified ports, and the organized supply lines. She could not win on their terms. Nzinga's response was an act of brutal strategic realism. She abandoned the kingdom of Ndongo. She could not defend a fixed capital, so she ordered a mass evacuation, leading her people eastward, deep into the dense, almost impassable jungles and the vast, forbidding marshes of the interior. This was not a retreat. It was an act of strategic warfare on a massive scale. She relocated her entire military and political structure, making her people effectively invisible to the cumbersome Portuguese military machine. She forced her enemy to chase shadows into a landscape hostile to Europeans. Disease, not musket fire, became her first great weapon. This strategy was the foundation of what would become a 40-year guerrilla war. Nzinga's forces perfected the art of the ambush and swift retreat. They refused open battle, instead targeting Portuguese supply lines, isolating small scouting parties, and draining the enemy's resources through relentless harassment. The Portuguese, expecting decisive engagements, found themselves constantly bogged down, dying not from glorious wounds but from dysentery, malaria, and exhaustion. The expense of chasing Nzinga was bankrupting the colony. But even this brilliant military tactic was not enough to secure permanent safety. Nzinga needed an aggressive, mobile military shield to protect her growing population of refugees and escaped slaves. She needed a force that was as feared and unpredictable as the Portuguese themselves. This led to her most ethically complex and strategically shocking decision, the alliance with the Mbangala. The Mbangala were a devastatingly effective nomadic soldier society known across West Central Africa for their sheer military ferocity and their frightening customs, including ritual murder and the elimination of children to maintain their mobile warrior ethos. The Portuguese had tried and failed to control them, but Nzinga saw in them the perfect, professional military complement to her guerrilla infantry. To seal the alliance in the 1630s, the Mbangala demanded that Nzinga submit to their laws. This was the ultimate price. She had to renounce her traditional queenly status and enter into a ritual marriage. Most dramatically, she was required to adopt the male title of king and perform the necessary violent rituals to secure their loyalty. This was an agonizing personal sacrifice, forcing her to abandon traditional legitimacy for sheer military necessity. Nzinga complied. She took the name Mbande and for a time fully immersed herself in the life of a warrior monarch. The resulting military force was unstoppable. With the Mbangala's fierce shock troops and Nzinga's brilliant logistical and strategic direction, the joint armies not only drove the Portuguese further back, but carved out a new, secure state deep in the interior, the powerful kingdom of Matamba. Matamba became Nzinga's true fortress. It was a state organized for perpetual war, a sanctuary for every African who fled the Portuguese slave camps. Yet, having achieved the military goal, Nzinga knew the Mbangala customs were incompatible with building a long-lasting, organized state. In a stunning political pivot, having secured Matamba and pushed the Portuguese into a near meltdown, Nzinga shed the Mbangala alliance. She broke from their customs and, most audaciously, performed another complete political and spiritual transformation. She embraced Catholicism and took the baptismal name Dona Ana de Souza. Nzinga's tactical baptism into Dona Ana de Souza proved its worth just 3 years later. In 1641, the true power struggle was no longer just between Matamba and Luanda. It was between the great maritime empires of Europe. The Dutch West India Company, seeking to break Portugal's monopoly on the Atlantic slave trade and commerce, launched a massive naval assault and seized the strategic port of Luanda itself. The shockwave that hit the Portuguese administration was immense, but for Nzinga, it was the sound of opportunity knocking. She wasted absolutely no time. The previous diplomatic groundwork, where she presented herself as a legitimate Christian sovereign, allowed her to act instantly. She dispatched envoys to the newly arrived Dutch commanders, not as a desperate refugee seeking shelter, but as a sovereign power offering a military alliance. The Dutch, new to the harsh realities of the African interior and immediately facing Portuguese counterattacks from their inland forts, saw Nzinga as indispensable. They possessed the naval power and the guns. Nzinga possessed the unbeatable knowledge of the terrain, the intelligence networks, and the only reliable, organized fighting force capable of enduring the jungle war. Thus began the 7-year proxy war, a brutal and methodical campaign of annihilation against the remaining Portuguese strongholds. Nzinga did not simply offer her army, she became the chief strategist of the African front. Her troops, the highly mobile Matamba warriors, armed with local weapons and a few coveted muskets supplied by the Dutch, became the unstoppable, unseen hammer of the alliance. The Matamba forces specialized in what the Portuguese hated most: logistical strangulation. First, Nzinga ordered the systematic destruction of Portuguese supply routes. Their main fortified city, Masangano, was entirely dependent on external supplies. Nzinga's troops would not attack the fort directly. Instead, they ambushed every caravan, blocked every river crossing, and poisoned every well outside the fortress walls. The Portuguese, confined to their forts, began to starve, their European troops succumbing to disease and desperation. The Matamba warriors were masters of surveillance, melting into the dense brush after every swift, surgical strike, leaving only hunger and panic behind. Nzinga then focused on intelligence and psychological warfare. Her network of freed people and spies within the Portuguese territory was unparalleled. She knew the troop movements, the internal squabbles among the Portuguese commanders, and the locations of local African chiefs still loyal to Luanda. She systematically targeted and neutralized these loyalists, either by persuasion or force, ensuring the Portuguese became increasingly isolated and friendless in the hostile interior. The true genius of this period was Nzinga's flexibility. When the Portuguese mounted counter-campaigns, Matamba forces would engage just long enough to draw the enemy deep into the interior, forcing them to burn vital resources and expose their flanks, only to retreat at the critical moment. This strategy preserved Matamba's strength while ensuring the Portuguese forces were relentlessly bled dry. The alliance was incredibly successful. Between 1641 and 1648, Nzinga's relentless military pressure, combined with Dutch sea power, drove the Portuguese out of nearly all their inland strongholds. Nzinga successfully reclaimed vast swathes of her ancestral kingdom of Ndongo, freeing thousands of her people who had been enslaved. Her capital in Matamba grew into a truly formidable power, recognized by the Dutch as a legitimate, essential trading partner, entirely bypassing the old Portuguese colonial structure. However, the geopolitical tide eventually turned again. In 1648, a massive Portuguese fleet mounted a counterattack and successfully recaptured Luanda from the Dutch. The Dutch, having suffered heavy losses, retreated. Once again, Nzinga found herself standing alone against a resurgent empire. But this was not the collapse the Portuguese expected. Nzinga had not been depending on the Dutch to win the war. She had been using them to win time. She had used the 7 years to resupply her army massively, secure her borders, train a new generation of commanders, and consolidate her political authority over Matamba. The Portuguese returned to find not a ruined rebel, but a disciplined, well-armed, and strategically placed sovereign who was more powerful than ever. The decades of proxy war and logistical strangulation had worked. The Portuguese were exhausted, facing a military genius they could not defeat in the field. This forced the stalemate that led to the final necessary peace of 1657. The silence that followed the treaty signing in 1657 was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of utter mutual exhaustion. The Portuguese had not withdrawn in defeat. They had consented to a stalemate engineered entirely by Nzinga. The moment they affixed their seal to the document, formally acknowledging Dona Ana de Sousa as the reigning queen of Matamba, was the moment the colonial dream of smooth, total conquest died. They recognized her not because they chose to, but because they could no longer afford not to. Nzinga, now an elder, had forced their hand using decades of brilliant guerrilla warfare, diplomatic double-crosses, and the merciless logic of the proxy war. The surrender was not Matamba's. It was Portugal's final admission that their superior muskets, their cavalry, and their endless naval power were utterly useless against a sovereign who had simply outthought them for 40 years. This hard-won recognition rewrote the map. It rewrote the future. The air in Matamba was thick with defiant survival, proving that the African will, when backed by uncompromising strategy, could turn back an empire's dream. She died in 1663 at the age of 81, having successfully defended her people and established a powerful, independent state. Nzinga didn't just fight colonialism, she institutionalized resistance. She built a military machine that used terrain, diplomacy, psychology, and tactical alliances to ensure her people's survival. Matamba remained independent for another century, a beacon of freedom and a testament to her ruthless, tactical brilliance. So when you walk through the history of Angola today, remember the woman who refused to kneel. Remember the king who became a dona, and the general who used European rivalries as her own personal artillery. Subscribe to Lost History and learn about Africa's truth and heritage.